Disclaimer. Blah, 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 blah. Yggdrasil, or as my Danish son who can actually pronounce it calls it,
Yggdrasil. In Norwegian, Yggdrasil.
is an immense mythical tree that plays a central role in Norse cosmology, where it connects the 9 worlds. Like Dante's 9 circles of hell, or the 9 lives of a cat falling out of a window, we think of this as a vertical metaphor. But what if it's actually horizontal? Our 7 continents fit in imperfectly with Tesla's energetic vortex laws of 3, 6, and 9. I'm pretty sure he would have mentioned 7 if it was important. Cami Nodell points out in her brilliant work that based on our current magnetic field understanding of the Earth, unfortunately, given to us by the same bullshit Jesuit con artists who gave us the Big Bang monkey ball Earth, that we are missing at least 1 continent. But what if we are missing 2 continents, making 9 total? The first, Lemuria, in the Pacific Ocean, once between Australia and the Americas, the crown chakra of the Earth. And second, the heart chakra, Atlantis, in the Atlantic Ocean. As the macrocosm, so the microcosm. Has microcosmic mankind literally fallen from the Garden of Eden, his higher God mind, losing the ability to think in his higher mind or to feel for his fellow man, animal, earth, and being, because our macrocosmic Earth has literally lost its geographical head, Lemuria or Mu, and its heart, Atlantis? In fact, when you place microcosmic man over a flat projection of macrocosmic Earth, some startling revelations appear. Not only is his crown chakra where Lemuria once was, or his green heart chakra where Atlantis was, but his lungs are right where the dense oxygen-giving forests of the Amazon, North America, Canada, and Alaska are, and his red genitalia chakra of war and lust are right where the scarlet red whore of Babylon are, which is where ancient mystery Babylon and modern-day Israel are. But that's none of my business. As Plato stated, the island of Atlantis and the whole Atlantic Ocean is named after Poseidon's eldest son, Atlas. Esoterically, Atel was the Aztec name for the zodiac sign and age of Pisces. Pisces is the feet in the human body. Thus, the Atlantic is derived from the Latin word atlas, meaning to bear, therefore to create support. In mythology, Atlas holds up the world. We could say the same about our heart, as life ends when it takes its final beat. But the Earth is a round record pancake, like the Gleason map, you say? That's okay. When you place the energetic pattern of all creation over that, also known as the esoteric cosmic embryo, it still lines up. Exactly. Lemuria Mu, Earth's sunken crown chakra. The Amazon, North American lungs. Atlantis, Earth's sunken heart chakra. And the red scarlet chakra whore of Babylon and Israel. Speaking of cosmic embryos, when you zoom out overhead from Mount Rushmore completely, there appears to be a gigantic petrified baby curled up there. But Titans probably weren't real, so that's also none of my business. But let's get back to David Latimer from Part 4 and his unwatered bottle garden. It started with one seed, a tiny bit of compost, and some water. But after 40 years, his little plants sit on a massive pile of earthen compost, which has obviously formed from decaying, fallen plant matter throughout the years. Which begs the questions. What are continents really? Why does vegetation grow so quickly and in abundance on our soil? Is it possible that we live and walk on God knows how many years of decaying compost from an ancient world full of gigantic trees that beggars our comprehension? We'd like to share some comments from our brilliant Space Busters subs who give us more questions than we give them answers, and who are the only reason we continue to do this shared learning venture. Bob points out that there is a mycelium mushroom mat that covers the entire United States just under the ground. One giant mushroom, hundreds of miles large, just inches under the ground that most people have no idea exists. Guilty as charged. Nothing to see here, Space Busters. Move along. Andrew L. says, what if the flood surrounding the Earth, actually made of salted and other mineralized water, caused a drowning and slow petrification with high pressure over a short amount of time, 100 days or so, I'd call that a fast petrification, and created this result of tree stumps above and oil below as the roots were broken down. The trees were possibly cut before that, but then later along came this flood. Some of them left still standing and broken by swift water waves could have created some of the mountains that we have today. Mudflood Giants, who gets an A+ for his channel name alone, blew us away with this little gem of a video on bushcraft extraction of crude oil out of dead tree roots using fire or heat, as we discussed in alternative volcanism theory in Part 4.
I talked to a guy when I was up in Alaska. He said, he told me he works in the oil field drilling for oil near Barrow. He said they drill down 1,000 feet through permanently frozen ground, permafrost, and hit trees. He said one day they were drilling and hit a tree, and they always take whatever they drill out and lay it on the ground beside them to go, develop a sample of what's down in the ground. He said they drilled straight through the top of a tree that was 300 feet tall, standing up. This is on the north slope of Alaska. Folks, I was just up there. There are no trees. We saw one tree growing in a Chinese restaurant inside, about this big. That's it. There are no trees in Barrow, Alaska. There are certainly no trees 300 feet tall. There are very few trees in the world 300 feet tall. Some of the redwoods are that size, but how do you get 300-foot tree standing up under 1,000 feet of permanently frozen ground? What happened? When they drill down through the ice, sometimes they find strange things. Like in Antarctica, they drilled down, which is at the bottom of the world here. Well, we call it the bottom. Of course, you can't tell when you're standing there, but at the south end of the world, they drilled down through the ice and hit coal. There's enormous evidence of huge forests in Antarctica where there's not one tree growing today. There's not a blade of grass growing down there. Admiral Byrd said he found frozen palm leaves under the ice near the South Pole, and thousands of well-preserved leaves found in Antarctica. What happened? 250 miles from the South Pole, they find frozen leaves in the side of a cliff. There are no trees there, none, zero. This article talks about the discovery of these leaves. They have their original cellular content. These leaves are not fossilized. They're still leaves. Up in northern Canada, there's a place called Ellis Island. There on Ellesmere Island, there are no trees at all, none, yet they find petrified redwood stumps up there. There are certainly no redwood trees growing up there in northern Canada, okay? There are only a few select locations where they grow along the California coast and up into Oregon a little bit. I debated Jeannie Scott. She's the president of the National Center for Science Education in Berkeley, California. The National Center is a little bitty storefront building with 5 people in there. But I debated Jeannie Scott in a debate, and she said, Dr. Hovind, there are 80 separate layers of coal in the Midwest. She's right. She said, if you look at the amount of coal in the world today, the entire biomass, all the plants of the world today, could not possibly be converted to that much fossil fuel. She's right again. There is so much coal in the world that if you took every tree and blade of grass and bush and squished it, you couldn't make all the coal. There are enormous volumes of coal in the earth. I said, Jeannie, you are right. She said, well, don't you see, Hovind, there had to be an enormous amount of time to lay down all the coal seams. Oh, no. Right there, she's wrong. You see, she's looking at today's world and assuming that's how it's always been. The coal we find in the ground today is a result of that flood which buried the world before the flood, when they had lots more trees. There's a coal mine in Montana that is 10,000 square miles of coal up to 200 feet thick. Someone told me a few months ago they've now found a seam 300 feet thick. That's a lot of coal. A lot of coal. And sometimes in coal, human artifacts are found. This bell was found inside a lump of coal. This iron pot was found inside a lump of coal. The sole of a shoe found inside a lump of coal. We cover more on that on video 6. But the Bible says there were herbs, that's plants, over all the earth. It's not that way today. 70% of the earth is underwater, for heaven's sake. Okay, that's not covered with plants. The earth was covered with plants when God made it. Did you know they find leaves in Antarctica? 250 miles from the South Pole, they're finding leaves. There are no trees in the South Pole. 70% of the earth today is underwater. Did you know only 3% of this earth is habitable for mankind? A lot of it's under desert, ice caps, tundra, mountain ranges nobody can live on. 3% is habitable. Probably the pre-flood world was, I would just be picking a number and say probably 80% land and only 20% water. The oceans weren't there. The water was in the crust of the earth or in the canopy overhead. But there were trees from pole to pole before the flood came.
Dr. Walt Brown's hydroplate theory on the mechanics of how the Great Flood may have happened is absolutely plausible and fascinating, but he never offered a theory as to the trigger mechanism of why it happened, nor do we resonate at all with Dr. Hovind's theory that a giant ice comet half the size of our alleged Spaceball solar system broke up and hit the Earth. After we look at a summary of Walt's theory, we'll propose our own original theory as to what the trigger mechanism may have been, based on a mind-shattering video sent to us by another ace Spacebusters sub, B. Rush. Dr. Brown?
We can see on our planet 17 very strange features which can now be systematically explained as a result of a cataclysmic global flood whose waters erupted from subterranean chambers with an energy release exceeding the explosion of 10 billion hydrogen bombs. This explanation shows us just how rapidly major mountains formed. It explains the coal and oil deposits, the rapid continental drift, why on the ocean floor there are huge trenches and hundreds of canyons and volcanoes. It explains the formation of the layered strata and most of the fossils, the frozen mammoths, the so-called ice ages, and major land canyons, especially the Grand Canyon. The pre-flood Earth probably had only one very large supercontinent covered with lush vegetation. There were seas and major rivers. The mountains were smaller than today's, but perhaps 9,000 feet high. According to the hydroplate theory, the pre-flood Earth had a lot of subterranean water, about half of what is now in our oceans. This water was contained in interconnected chambers, forming a thin spherical shell, about half a mile thick, perhaps 10 miles below the Earth's surface. Increasing pressure in the subterranean water stretched the crust, just as a balloon stretches when the pressure inside increases. Failure in the crust began with a microscopic crack which grew in both directions at about 3 miles per second. The crack, following the path of least resistance, encircled the globe in about 2 hours. As the crack raced around the Earth, the overlying rock crust opened up like a rip in a tightly stretched cloth. The subterranean water was under extreme pressure because of the weight of the 10 miles of rock pressing down on it. So the water exploded violently out of the rupture. All along this globe-encircling rupture, fountains of water jetted supersonically, almost 20 miles into the atmosphere. The spray from this enormous fountain produced torrential rains, such as the Earth has never experienced before or after. The Bible states that all the fountains of the great deep burst open on one day. And it describes these events about 5,000 years ago, which we can now tie together scientifically. Some of the water jetting high above the cold stratosphere froze into supercooled ice crystals and produced some massive ice dumps, burying, suffocating, and instantly freezing many animals, including the frozen mammoths of Siberia and Alaska. The high-pressure fountains eroded the rock on both sides of the crack, producing huge volumes of sediments that settled out of this muddy water all over the Earth. These sediments trapped and buried plants and animals, forming the fossil record. This erosion widened the rupture. Eventually, the width was so great that the compressed rock beneath the subterranean chamber sprung upward, giving birth to the mid-oceanic ridge that wraps around the Earth like the seam of a baseball. The continental plates, the hydroplates, still with lubricating water beneath them, slid downhill away from the rising mid-Atlantic ridge. After the massive, slowly accelerating continental plates reached speeds of about 45 miles per hour, they ran into resistances, compressed, and buckled. The portions of the hydroplate that buckled down formed ocean trenches. Those that buckled upward formed mountains. This is why the major mountain chains are parallel to the oceanic ridges from which they slid. The hydroplates, in sliding away from the oceanic ridges, opened up very deep ocean basins into which the floodwaters retreated. On the continents, each bowl-shaped depression or basin was naturally left brimful of water, producing many post-flood lakes.
The demonstrations you have just witnessed of a massive worldwide catastrophe in antiquity supports the biblical story of the deluge in every detail.
Dr. Brown's point is what we discussed in part 1. When we look at the shapes of the oceanic ridges against the major mountain chains, they fit more like a glove in shape, direction, and contour than the actual continents themselves do in the Pangea theory. The Andes, the Great Escarpment of South Africa, the Rockies, the Great Dividing Range of Australia, the Himalayas. The Ural Mountains match the Pacific Ridge thousands of miles away. Even the smaller ranges of Norway match the North Sea Ridge. But what mechanism could cause the entire Earth to fracture in these particular shapes and ridge patterns, and why not somewhere else? Back to B. Rush and the video he sent us. These small trees are catching a heavy top wind like a sail, and literally pulling the solid ground up beneath them with their roots. The non-moving leaves on the ground show this isn't even a hurricane-force wind.
Of course, mainstream geology tells us that wind plays a significant role in shaping the landscape of our planet, supposedly incrementally over countless eons of time. But as Andrew has proposed in numerous past videos, the Earth's wind-sheared landscape reveals unique patterns which may have been produced by ionized shock waves in primordial electric storms. In part 4 of this 10-part series, Andrew argues for a new perspective on wind in Earth geology, not as a slow erosional force, but a short-lived and violent one.
If you study Earth's surface and look at details in its form, there are obvious patterns. Arcing patterns of mountain ranges and island chains, strange swirls and looping cracks on the ocean floor, and on close inspection there's harmony in the shape of mountains and other terrain. Sometimes it's geometric with triangles, arcs, and star patterns, but usually it's more fluid, like a crazy paisley. Consensus thought is this is a result of a series of unrelated events that occurred over billions of years, driven by the slow churn of Earth's crust subducting the continental plates and the constant wear of erosion. EU thinks it didn't happen that way. We think it was caused by electricity, and the patterns we see make more sense if viewed in the context of our theory. The face of the Earth was shaped by 3 primary means: volcanic eruption, lightning, and wind. It occurred in primordial storms which ionized the atmosphere, charged the ground like a battery, and discharged energy the same way we see today: earthquakes, volcanoes, and storms. Only these storms were beyond biblical. They occurred before man arrived. What we are talking about today are the storms of creation, which shaped the face of the planet. Because wind played the biggest role in laying and piling the sediments we live on, its effects are most visible. The evidence is in supersonic shock waves imprinted on the land. Once you start recognizing the characteristics of wind-formed topography, it becomes almost impossible to ignore. This indicates the jet stream velocity transitioned from supersonic to near subsonic velocity along the wind front of this dune.
But what if Andrew's assumptions that this sudden superplasma storm was primordial are wrong? And what would happen to the ground if subsonic and supersonic winds hit an Earth full of trees that were not 20 feet high, but 20 to 60 miles high, with an interconnected root system deeply entrenched in the ground? Could this be the mechanism that caused the cracks in the Earth in Dr. Brown's hydroplate theory? Could this be why none of the ancient megatrees are left standing today? Were they literally ripped out of the ground by the roots, by supersonic winds and the ensuing worldwide flood?
All right, that's Walt Brown's hydroplate theory, which I think is excellent. A couple key things he talks about in there is that the canyons had to form quickly as lakes overflowed their boundary. But the other thing is about the mid-Atlantic ridge. What would cause that? This picture here shows that if a spring is compressed and you have 2 bricks on top of it, as the bricks slide apart, all of a sudden the spring's going to pop up in the center. Granite apparently was the original basement rock, and it was not formed by melting rock cooling down. Well, Halos.com, Robert Gentry has an excellent book called Creation's Tiny Mystery, which proves granite was never a hot molten mass. It was created instantly, like the Bible says, under water. We covered that in video 7. Under the granite was apparently a layer of water, where the subterranean water chambers were, and then a layer of basalt, which is a different kind of rock. The basalt underneath would spring up into the crack as the mid-Atlantic ridge got wider. As these ridges widened, as Walt Brown says, it's going to spring up. The basalt will bounce up in the center, and the plates will slide away. So there was movement of the plates, but that's not proof for Pangea. Now what happened, as the basalt springs up, it's going to crack, and water's going to fill in the cracks. Now today, they're not only full of water, they're full of sediments. It's been 400 years since the flood. The cracks are gone. They're all full of dirt. But when they measured the magnetic intensity, what they were actually finding were the cracks where the water rushed in. Because as basalt cools down, it stores a stronger magnetic field. If the basalt is hot, it doesn't store a magnetic field. You can put a magnet in your oven, heat it up, it'll lose its magnetic strength. So it's simply finding the cracks where the earth busted up into plates. That's all they're finding. Get the book if you want. Well, he's got a whole section on that in his book here in the beginning. Hot basalt loses its magnetism, and cold basalt stores a strong magnetic field. So that's what they were finding at the bottom of the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. There are no places where a north-seeking compass points south. Now, it is true there is still a little bit of subduction today, as in, plates of the earth are being drawn under. If you ever cook pudding or something, and it develops a skin on it, sometimes the skin on the pudding all of a sudden will just sink to the bottom. And if you push it down in one place, it'll draw more down with it, okay? I think some of that is happening or has happened with the crust of the earth. Sections have slid down under. Hawaii, for instance, is over a hot spot, and it appears to be moving. I think there is plate subduction right there. But I don't think it's been going on for millions of years.
But if basalt is allegedly formed from the rapid cooling of lava, rich in micronutrients such as magnesium and iron, found in abundance in plants and trees, exposed at or very near the surface of a terrestrial planet, then what the hell is it doing miles below the surface as a bottom layer of earth crust underneath a massive layer of granite and even at the bottom of our oceans? How did it get there, if not a foundation of tree and plant roots, and not once very near the actual surface of the earth, as geology claims? As Clive Mossmoon sarcastically pointed out in Part 4, the structures like Devil's Tower you are calling tree stumps are made of basalt, which never has more than 60% silica. Petrified organic matter like trees should be in the 95% silica range. Oops. Oops indeed, Clive. But we had the same thought about the giant tree theory. If trees are carbon-based, why are petrified organic matter 90% silica? On the Jesuit periodic table of theoretical atomic particle elements, carbon and silicon sit right next to each other in group 14, the carbon family. Just like the Jews, Muslims, and Christians all belong to the same Abrahamic religions. As they say in Thailand, same, but different. The key difference between silicon and carbon is that carbon is non-metal, whereas silicon is a metalloid. I have no clue what that means, and apparently neither does lamestream science, as they define a metalloid as an imprecise term used to describe a chemical element that forms a simple substance having properties intermediate between those of a typical metal and a typical nonmetal. There is no single property which can be used to unambiguously identify an element as a metalloid. Well, that clears everything up. Thanks for that.
And it doesn't take long for things to petrify, not at all. Things can petrify very quickly. We've got some examples here on the table of things that petrified very quickly. I'll show you those in a second. Here's a picture of a petrified water wheel. Here's petrified firewood. It was chopped on before it got petrified. You can go to Southern Forest World Museum in Georgia, Waycross, Georgia. There's a mummified dog stuck inside a tree. Some people say it's petrified. I don't know if it's mummified. I've not been there yet. But anyway, how can a dog get mummified just in probably a few years? Chased a coon up the tree, got stuck. They named it Stucky, of course. That's the name for the dog. They had a contest to name it, and so they called it Stucky. They cut the tree down for firewood. There's a dog inside. Here's a petrified cowboy boot with the cowboy's legs still in it. The boot was made in the 1950s. Got his leg shot off or torn off or who knows what, but there's his leg petrified. Here's a petrified fish giving birth. A petrified hammer was found from a Marine barracks from World War II. Petrified hammer. Petrified hat found in New Zealand. Here's a kid sent me this right here on the table, a petrified crayon found in Arizona. I mean, the crayon is turned to stone. We have right here a petrified pickle. It's in our museum. Well, it's here tonight, but a guy sent me this and the jar with it. The jar is still in our museum. He said, Brother Hovind, I found this old house in Montana. The roof was gone. The house had been empty at least 30 years. But we were digging around through what's left of this house and found the pantry. And there were pickle jars in there, but the lid to one of the jars rusted, and the pickle inside turned to stone. Would you like it for your museum? I said, well, yeah, of course. One kid wrote me a letter. Here's the letter right here. He said, Brother Hovind, I was 8 years old doing a science experiment. I put a bunch of acorns in a bucket of water to see if they would sprout. And I forgot about them. A year later, my mom saw the bucket on the back porch. She said, get rid of that bucket and all that junk out there. He said, the acorns had turned to stone in 1 year. I have right here a baggie of petrified acorns. It doesn't take long, folks. Don't let them tell you it takes millions of years for things to petrify. It's not true. A guy sent me a picture of a petrified pin cushion. The pin cushion, you can see the pins had rusted off, except where you can see the rust marks where the pins had been stuck in there. Petrified pin cushion. They dug up a grave in Tennessee several years ago. They found the body of the person inside the grave had petrified, turned to stone. The doctor died and they buried him. 14 years later, his wife died. This is back in 1881. They dug a hole to bury Grandma, and water went into the hole. And they thought, oh, we don't want to bury Grandma in the water, so they buried her someplace else. And then the kids got worried about Grandpa in that moving water. It hit an underground spring, apparently. So they dug up Grandpa. He'd been in the ground 14 years. And the article says, the occupant of the coffin had been turned to stone, presumably as a result of the continual flow of water. It said the arms had rotted off, but the rest of the body had turned to stone, petrified. A guy found a petrified man in Montana. He took it 5'8". The guy carried it around as a museum curiosity for years in carnivals and fairs and stuff. Petrified body of a man found on the beach in Montana, in a beach of a river. In Sao Paulo, Brazil, a lady went into the hospital. She said, my side's been hurting. The lady was 62 years old. They x-rayed her and found a petrified fetus, a baby, inside. She had been pregnant. The baby almost came to term and died, apparently, and turned to stone inside her body. 62-year-old lady with a petrified baby inside. Here's the article. You can read it for yourself. I met a guy in Maryland who said he worked at a hospital, Brian Lackey, who lives in Washington, but there's his phone number. He was in Maryland. He said they brought a lady in there and took out a petrified fetus out of her body. The baby's in the museum now, or in a medical hospital up there. Petrified fetus. Here's petrified sacks of flour found in Arkansas. A flour mill flooded. The flour turned to stone. The sacks of flour were buried in water and mud and turned to rock. So the Bible says the high hills were covered. The earth was totally covered by a flood. 15 cubits, that's about 22 feet, over the mountains. So the skeptics say, where'd all the water go? Oh, it's still here. The Bible says in Genesis chapter 8, the waters assuaged. That means to drop down, to sink down. If we filled this room 4 feet deep in water, and then all of a sudden the floor caved in over here and dropped down 10 feet, that's going to suck all the water from there into the hole. Well, during the flood, you'd get this sinking process as the ocean floors would drop out and the water would rush into those holes. The Bible says the water stood above the mountains. So I think during the first few months of the flood, the animals sorted out and fossils were forming. During the last part of the flood, the plates of the earth are still shifting and they're unstable, and they began to lift up or sink down different places. Thin spots sink down, other places lift up, forming mountain ranges. Water rushes off, forming erosion in a hurry. The Bible says in Psalm 104, at thy rebuke, they fled. At the voice of thy thunder, they hasted away, talking about the water. It says they go up by the mountains, they go down by the valleys. Now, many reference Bibles have a footnote right here, because this is an Old English phrase. What this is saying is the mountains arose, the valleys sank down. During the last part of the flood, the mountains actually lifted up. So, was Mount Everest underwater? Mount Everest wasn't there. It formed during the last part of the flood as the mountains lifted up. So that area was underwater. That's how you explain the clams on top, but Mount Everest technically wasn't there until after the flood, or during the flood it formed. The ocean crust is thinner than continental crust. They know this from earthquakes, checking the S&P waves with kind of like doing a sonogram of the earth. They do that all the time. Thinner spots would tend to sink down. Water's going to rush in, filling in these places, causing oceans. The crust of the earth is about 30 miles thick under the continents and about 3 to 5 miles thick under the oceans. And the earth all busted up into plates like that. And some are still moving.
Which gets back to our question from part 4. Do sea levels rise or do land masses sink? If there is any truth to this hydroplate flood theory, it seems more likely that the ruins we find 200 feet underwater off the coasts of continents have slid underwater through leftover subduction, either quickly or slowly as ocean crusts collapse or continue to slide. It seems highly unlikely that they could have survived the forces of such a flood event, but who knows? They are crumbled and destroyed, and perhaps they are the remnants of pre-deluge civilizations. Is this what happened to Atlantis? And why are the crusts 30 miles thick under the continents and only 3 to 5 miles thick under the oceans? Were these continents already giant mounds of fallen compost from where ancient forests of 20 to 60 mile high trees were, and the oceans the equivalent of enormous ancient treeless prairies and plains thousands of miles across, lowland valleys that the great floodwaters receded into and settled as our oceans today? And what about our wild speculation that titans may have walked the earth and before the flood, all things were exponentially bigger than today? I am well aware of Eric Dubay's idea that the entire dinosaur story is a hoax and a business scam to make billions from museums showing fake bones made in China. I agree with the latter part and do agree that certain alleged dinosaurs are complete fabrications to make the industry seem more exciting and imaginative. But I am also open to the possibility that certain dinosaurs were nothing more than much larger and differently micro-evolved ancestors of the same animals that still walk the earth today. Just as Megalodon was to the great white shark, or woolly mammoth to the elephant, saber-tooth to the tiger, and perhaps giants to the titans.
And they've got a new theory now that says maybe a lack of oxygen killed the dinosaurs. A lack of oxygen. Why would they say that? Well, they had a big symposium in 1993. A bunch of scientists got together to study the Apatosaurus. And they said, folks, we've got a problem. An 80-foot Apatosaurus had nostrils the same size as a horse. How is an 80-foot animal going to get enough air through nostrils the same size as a horse? He'd be sucking so hard trying to get a breath, it'd set him on fire from the friction from the wind whistling in there. They couldn't breathe. Well, apparently they did breathe because bones of dinosaurs are found all over the planet. Even in Antarctica and Alaska. I mean, dinosaurs lived everywhere, okay? So how could an 80-foot animal get enough air? Well, today he probably couldn't. Not to get 80 feet long, but I think before the flood came, they had this canopy of air or of water or ice that would increase air pressure. Plus, they had richer oxygen. You know, when they drill into the amber, how many saw the movie Jurassic Park, you know, where they drilled in to get the mosquito blood out? Sometimes in amber, which is petrified tree sap, they find air bubbles in the amber. When they analyze the air bubbles, they find out they're 50% more oxygen than we have today. Today, we're breathing 21% oxygen. Amber bubbles have 32% oxygen. Did you know if you lived in a world with double the air pressure and 50% more oxygen, the Earth had more oxygen in the past than it does now? Now, you kids are going to be told in textbooks that the Earth had no oxygen at the beginning when life was evolving, called a reducing atmosphere. That is baloney. We cover all that about video 4, about how life began. It could not have evolved with oxygen or without oxygen. But if you double the air pressure and increase oxygen, not only does your hemoglobin take on oxygen like it's supposed to, your plasma will get oxygen saturated, which means you could run hundreds of miles without getting tired. Adam and Eve didn't need a car. They could run to grandma's. Only they didn't have a grandma. Or mother-in-law, by the way. That's why it was paradise. Actually, my wife had a great mother-in-law. But I think before the flood came, I think things were a whole lot different. With increased oxygen, you would heal up much faster. How many of you remember baby Jessica that fell into the well in Texas? 18 months old, her left leg slipped down in a pipe, her right leg came up behind her, and she did the splits as she slid down inside an 8-inch steel pipe. She went down 20 feet and was stuck there for 2.5 days. They tore up the whole neighborhood trying to get that kid out of that well. It was on the news about every 15 minutes. Remember that? You know, baby Jessica's still alive. When they finally got her out of that well, lots of her body had turned black from lack of circulation. Her right leg was totally black because it had been twisted around and stuck in her face from behind, doing the splits. One of the doctors said, we have to cut her leg off immediately. Another doctor said, hey, before we cut the leg off, let's just try putting her in a hyperbaric oxygen chamber. You know what? Hyperbaric oxygen. They put Jessica in one of these chambers, filled it up full of pure oxygen, and pumped it up to double normal pressure. Within a few hours, her leg turned pink. They restored circulation. They saved her leg. They did have to amputate half of her little toe, okay? They couldn't save that. It beats losing a leg by a long shot. West Germany is treating stroke patients with hyperbaric oxygen, getting incredible recovery from strokes. In England, they're treating multiple sclerosis. They treat all kinds of diseases with hyperbaric chambers. In India, they're treating leprosy, getting incredible results. Here's a kid being treated for cerebral palsy with hyperbaric oxygen. Doctors have discovered if they add more oxygen during surgery when the person's under anesthetic, only half as many patients get infections and only half as many people get nauseated, just by giving the sleeping patient more oxygen. Interesting. There's a chamber in New York that treats autism with hyperbaric oxygen. Hyperbaric therapy's use as healing tool grows, article says. Here's a single-person chamber. Did you know the Dallas Cowboys have a hyperbaric chamber? Why would professional sports teams want a hyperbaric chamber? Well, because they've discovered their injured players will heal twice as fast. Zach, somebody from the Dolphins, says, about 3 times a week during the season, Zach chills out for an hour or so in a hyperbaric chamber, a 12-by-4 bag inflated with pure oxygen that helps the body heal and promotes a feeling of well-being. You can get your own hyperbaric sleeping bag if you want. A friend of mine in Oregon has a hyperbaric chamber. Here's my son running the camera back there, and his wife and I at an oxygen bar in Alaska. You sit down to eat lunch, and you breathe pure oxygen. You pay them $5 and you breathe pure oxygen while you're eating lunch. And when you get done, you feel like going shopping again. It's a conspiracy, I can tell you right now. The whole thing's a conspiracy to get you to spend more money. Okay? But then you feel great. My friend in Oregon has a hyperbaric chamber. I was out there. He said, Brother Hovind, would you like to try it? I said, yeah. He put me in there, gave me a book to read. He said, I'm going to shut the door and pump it up to triple normal pressure. They use the diving terms. You're going to dive to 90 feet. Well, you're sitting right there in the chamber. You don't go anywhere, but it's like scuba diving to 90 feet. He said, now, I'll let you out in about an hour. I was in there breathing pure oxygen for an hour, reading my book, under triple normal pressure. When he let me out, he said, how do you feel? I said, I feel like running around the world. This is incredible. Now, how many of you old-timers, your get up and go done, got up and went? You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Most exciting thing you can think of is taking a nap Sunday afternoon, right? Well, man, in the pre-flood world, if they had to double the air pressure and increased oxygen, you would just be full of energy all the time. There's a guy in Japan started raising tomato plants with pressurized carbon dioxide. You know, plants breathe CO2 not oxygen. His tomato plant grew faster than normal. When it was 2 years old, it was 16 feet tall and produced 900 tomatoes. They moved it to a shopping center and built scaffolding to hold the branches up. They said, you know, this thing might produce 10,000 tomatoes. This is one tomato plant. It ended up growing 40 feet tall and producing 15,000 tomatoes off one plant. It was a cherry tomato plant, but tomatoes were coming off baseball size off of his.
Obviously, there would have to have been more than 21% oxygen in the air and much greater air pressure than there is today. There would have to be a mechanism as a means of delivering massive amounts of oxygen to the atmosphere, like, for example, photosynthesis from 7-continent-sized jungles or forests, each 20 to 60 miles high, and obviously some kind of sealed container to trap and compress all of that extra gas into massive atmospheric pressure. As for where, then, did the rest of these alleged gargantuan trees go? Did they burn up in a supersonic wind plasma storm? Are they actually the giant petrified mountains today and not crustal basalt and granite? Were they chopped, used, and burned by titans? Are they buried under post-flood sediments and we're all standing on them right now? Or perhaps none of the above? Well, that's none of my business. Stay tuned for Atlantis Rising Part 5. Why we can't all just get along.